Hello, welcome to the Better Ways podcast. I'm Tom.
I'm Jamie.
Welcome, Jamie. It's been a while now.
It's been a while.
What could we possibly talk about today? What's been
The
happening?
the world ending, Tom.
Well,
Everything's
yeah,
going
so nothing
wrong.
happening. We'll talk about a tiny topic of very little importance.
Yeah, well, to be
aren't
fair,
we? Aren't we hearing that
feels
the
like the world.
world's ending every day?
Yeah, it does. Do you know what? We had like a handyman DIY slash builder guy around to do
Hmm.
our utility room before I went on
Yeah.
holiday, and he's like really sharp guy, lovely guy, very friendly,
Hmm.
very kind of like diverse in what he does, like excellent guy.
Hmm.
And we were talking about stuff. And he goes, yeah, it just all feels a bit apocalyptic at the moment, doesn't it? It's like every bit of news that comes out is like it's a real problem with no like easy solutions. And I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, it does feel that.
Is
It feels like
that
a little
is
bit,
that
yeah.
is that a natural effect? So, because everything's become bigger and more global and
Mm,
spread further, have we reached the point where everything starts to become existential threats?
yeah,
Because we're
yeah,
here, because it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and now the biggest we can have is something that will affect everybody.
yeah,
And
yeah.
obviously,
It's
we
a bit
had
like,
that with the pandemic. We've got that
yeah,
with
and in
AI
Ukraine, yeah,
and
exactly.
nuclear war and Ukraine. Yeah, yeah,
It's a bit like when a superhero gets their
and the
powers, they
environment.
start off fighting
Yeah.
low-level criminals, and then eventually each season it gets more and more apocalyptic.
So
That's
we're at
kind of
the we're at the
where we are.
top boss level.
Yeah,
Yeah,
top
yeah.
boss level. Yeah, like the galaxy eating
So
monster that comes along.
unless we're all going to die, it doesn't
Mm.
make a persistent news story. Is that what we're saying?
No, I also think though, Tom, there is an element now of the chickens coming home to roost
Right.
of the inevitable consequences of choices that have been
Mm,
made, and
mm.
you can say that about anything from now the water issues that obviously we've been
Yeah,
having
yeah.
now,
In the
and I
UK.
saw a
Yeah, yeah.
fantastic discussion on that, all the way to you and I talk about a lot our energy supply,
Yeah.
housing, and of course the big one that we said we were probably going to speak about today,
Mm,
which is the population collapse that's going on around
mm.
the world. It
Yeah.
seems like the last 50 to 60, okay, last 10 to 100 years worth of decisions where
Mm.
society has peaked and civilization has peaked, at least in
Yeah.
historical terms, the consequences of those decisions are now coming home to roost. And I
Hmm.
think there's such big issues, there are no easy solutions. It's not a question that we'll raise this interest rate, we'll do
Yeah.
this policy. They are things that require us to look at, our civilization on an existential level and go, right,
Yeah.
how do we change this? Because it's not, you
Mm.
can't tinker around the edges of this and hope it comes
No.
well.
So I get that. So let's look at what let's look at population and let's look at what
Mm,
led to that. So
mm,
my understanding is that way back in them olden days, uh, life was hard. People were poor. Families were big. If I go back, my
mm,
own family, there were commonly 10 or 12
mm,
um, in the family, so 8 to 10 children, and commonly two or three, sometimes more, of those children would die. This is
mm,
going back to the 19th century. And so people had large families because labour was essential.
mm,
Some of them wouldn't survive. Contraception
mm,
didn't exist.
mm,
Um, and children could do lots of useful things. I mean, obviously, they used to go up the chimneys and all sorts of other exploitative practices.
yeah.
Um, and so, and thus it was going back hundreds and thousands of years. And then a number of things seem to have happened. So obviously, health has got better, medicine's got better, so people are less likely to die. But also, labour has become far less important
Mm,
because work has become steadily more machine.
mm,
People have been replaced by machines of ever greater complexity.
mm,
And then you've had the big effect in the 20th century of the emancipation of women.
mm,
So you've ended up with a large number of people who always did some work and
mm,
obviously did a lot of work at home.
mm,
But instead of textiles and homemaking, have now moved into the same work practices as men.
mm,
So you now have households where there's two adults working, both have a career, um, and therefore there's an incentive to have fewer children. Well, there's no benefit in having more children except greater cost, because things like
yeah.
childcare,
Are
which wouldn't have been an
astronomical.
issue 100 years ago
Mm,
because you would have had relatives living with you that would have looked after the children.
yeah.
But issues like childcare now become really expensive, and the cost of feeding your children and education becomes expensive, whereas once it was free.
Mm,
Um, a normal level would have been free. Now it's huge amounts of debt. So
mm,
with all those things happening, and this seems to be true the world over, people have fewer and fewer children. They elect to have fewer and fewer children by a long way, so that now the average is below the replacement rate.
Significantly.
In the UK, but in the UK there's a lot of immigration of young people,
Yeah.
which balances it. But in some countries there isn't, like Japan and
Yeah.
Italy, and even places like Russia have a declining birth rate. So have I got that right? Have I overlooked anything
No, you pretty much nailed it. So
major?
yeah, you've nailed it. So yeah, I was watching a podcast the other day. You and I think briefly spoke about it before, called Modern Wisdom by
Yeah.
Chris Williamson.
Oh,
They had a
right.
guy
Yeah.
on whose name completely escapes me, but from what I gather, he runs a think tank that looks at population collapse and how do you solve it. And his story is quite fascinating. He works in private equity,
Yeah.
and he was sent to South Korea. And he makes his point in the podcast, and it was brilliant. He goes, private equity and investment banking look at different periods of time. He goes, investment banking is all about your return in the next 12 to 24 months. Where's the share price going? Because
Right.
private equities looks at emerging markets, emerging technologies, sub-markets, all these things, and goes, what's going to be big in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? And where do we put
Yeah.
our money to do it?
Yeah.
And he said he sat there and he was doing his research, which he's highly qualified to do, highly trained to do, in South Korea on the local market in South Korea.
Yeah.
And he goes, this is not adding up. And he went to his bosses and he went,
Yeah.
guys, South Korea is not going to exist in like 70 years. What are we doing? And they went, yeah, we know. We just have to keep telling people it's okay, so they put money here.
Right.
And
Right.
he came out with a shocking statistic, which I could not believe. 60% of people in South Korea are over 40 years of age.
Wow.
Which is insane.
Yeah.
And for every 100 people that are alive now, there will only be 5 grandchildren.
Wow.
That, when you think about that for a moment, as you look out of your window, if you look out your window and you look at the houses on your street, or if you're living in an apartment block and you look at your apartment block, and just imagine if the amount of people there went from 100 people living in that apartment block to 5 people living in that apartment block. Just think about what that means for the state of your society. It can't run. And I remember, and he talks about why this happens, and you hit the nail on the head there, Tom, which is there's multiple reasons. It's not just one.
Right. Lots. Yeah.
And he actually basically, to paraphrase it badly, to butcher it, is a combination of different things. The emancipation of women being one, birth control being another, Labour paying less than it did historically to afford things like families and so on. So, and he makes the point, it's a combination of culture and work. So culture from a point of view where people put off having kids till later because they want to have fun in life and all the rest of it, and they don't want more than one kid because it's hard work and blah, 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 blah. But he also makes the point that when women entered the workforce, work is now so financially unrewarding. It takes such a long time to get to a good level of income that normally you're in your 30s when you reach a good level of income. Yeah. And at that point, for a woman, once you're in your mid to late 30s, as I think you and I spoke about before, I know this from personal experience, your fertility falls off a cliff.
Right.
So because of that, your chance of having a child is hugely reduced. So
it's delaying having the first child is a big factor. Is that what I'm hearing?
Until so late, yeah. And then it's a combination of all those things. Yeah. We're having children so much later, the chance of having a child is a lot significantly lower. Therefore, your population is going to go like that. Now, what was really interesting was the nuances here, because we tend to think of this as being a first world Western problem.
Yeah.
But it's not. And again, he dove into the data and he looked at even countries like Iran, massive authoritarian government, women have far fewer rights than men. Even their fertility rate now is below the replacement level, which is unbelievable when you think about it. Yeah. So he then goes on to what's the solutions to this? Yeah. And he looks at the only places in the world that look like they're able to fight off this kind of tidal wave of low fertility are highly conservative cultures.
Right.
And he said even Iran wasn't conservative enough to do it.
Right? That's a bit worrying.
He's Jewish, and he talks about the culture.
Well, this is fascinating. Sorry to interrupt you, because I was thinking that one of the key changes is the changing definition of a family. So a traditional family has gone by the wayside as the model for people to have, a man and a woman, and then have children, bring up a number of children in the family home. And I suppose it went along with things like a job for life and
Yeah.
women being at home and things like that. But that model's completely gone because now people are told it's about yourself, it's about the individual. Yeah. Many people don't get married. Many people have series of short-term relationships.
Yeah.
Or they replace intimacy with a partner with, getting to know people over the internet.
Yeah.
Or, extended friends grouping. And also, obviously, children don't have the same experiences in the home if both parents are working. And that whole edifice has sort of been ripped down.
Yeah.
But has enough attention been paid to the good things about it, not just the bad?
No.
And that's what I was thinking while you were saying that. So I'm surprised that he mentioned that because that sort of suggests that is part of it.
It is 100% part of it. He talks about he almost talks about modern culture almost being like a disease, and it's infected other parts of the world. Again, I'm butchering his language. He did it in a lot more intellectual way than me, but it spreads around, and because of that, the problem has become spread around as well.
Right.
And for all the reasons that we've just said, the financial side and all the rest of it. But you'd think, so going back to the point, because so he's Jewish and he's talks about he's got a massive family and he's going to have loads of kids. He's only about 26 years old. He's going to have. He goes, I'm going to have about 8 kids. That's what my family do. Lots of kids. And he goes, so we're immune to the fertility crisis at the moment. And he said there are a couple of other cultures that are similar. And I think he talked. I can't remember who was it. The American kind of subculture.
The Mormons.
I think so.
Right.
I think it's the ones that live in like an agrarian states of.
Oh, technology. You're talking about Amish.
Yeah, the Amish. Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. But he said even they're having
because they're living a traditional lifestyle.
Correct. Yeah. But even they're having problems now. So what got really interesting though was the solution side of this.
Yes. Let's
and
hear
it sounds almost impossible.
Okay.
Because he goes the argument on and I used to hold this argument in my head as well. Well, childcare is so expensive, like you said.
Yeah.
If childcare is so expensive, if you can make it affordable, people will have more children. And this is what Hungary did. They spent 5% of their GDP to try and increase the birth rate, and it only moved the needle by 0.2%. So bugger all. So finances, in terms of paying for a child to go to daycare,
wasn't enough on its own.
Wasn't enough on its own. No. Yeah. So then going back to the work thing, if you could run a household on one income, you're probably likely to have more kids.
Yes, and that used to be the case.
Absolutely.
In the 20th century, that was the case.
Yeah. But even if you do that, is a woman willing to pause her career for 6 to 9 months or however long it takes?
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily have to be the woman, but one of you would have to.
In terms of even the bare minimum that a lady would normally be able to take off would be 3 months to recover from the birth and and
of course to have a child.
And then of course she might not be able to put as many hours in as she was before because she wants to spend time, and so it gets complicated. It's not a question of of just being as simple like one person doing it. But for me, my wife and I spoke about this. If we're lucky to have a kid, I'll be the primary caregiver because she out earns me significantly.
Right.
And I'm fine with that. I've got no issue with that.
Yeah.
But we can't afford more than one kid, and I'll have to keep on working in some way, shape, or form.
And is that partly back to house prices and things? If you have more children and the cost of just everything, I suppose, food, clothes.
I think everything links to house prices. Honestly, can you imagine if we hadn't had that problem and you would have bought our houses for 50% of what they are now?
You could easily have a house big enough for 3 or 4 kids, I suppose.
Well, but also think about your disposable income if costs were much lower as well. Yes. The whole thing a lot of it seems to come back to that. But going back to the kind of the macro look at it, if all these countries, and I googled this afterwards, and I found a list of the fertility rates for all nations, and the majority of them now, what we would call developed and developing nations, the developed world, forget about it, their fertility rate is off a cliff. I think it's 2.3, 2.4 is the replacement rate.
I think it's 2.1, but it's around that. Depends on the death. It depends on the death rate in infancy and all of that. But
I think UK is 1.7 at the moment.
But we import a lot. I think Japan is 1.3 or
1.4 or something like that. It's crazy.
Russia is similar, I think.
Yeah, that's right. So even countries that you wouldn't think that were having this problem are having this problem. And he talks about the other solution. He goes, and the solution that really scares him because it involves a degree of nastiness, and that is you offset the decline in the natural birth rate through immigration.
Yes,
As we know, we added
which we do.
600,000 last
Yeah,
year or whatever
yeah.
it was. In order to do that, though, you have to have something that is attractive for people to move.
Yes.
So he goes, it's in the West's interest. And he goes, this is a horror story because you can imagine them doing it. It's in the West's interest, or the developed world's interest, to keep the developing world as poor as possible so people will migrate to the developed world.
So then you've got cheap labour and all that coming in.
Well, just so your birth rate keeps going up, so your civilization doesn't collapse ultimately. Yes. And if that stops, if immigration does stop, our population over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years will just go like that. And he talks about as well, he goes, that people on the progressive side, particularly the green environmentalist side, always think that overpopulation is the biggest problem we face.
Well, there was an awful lot of literature on that in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Was this, I can't remember the guy's name, began with an M. It was a movement, Maltesian or something, I think?
Well, there were lots of movements. There was the Gaia movement, James Lovelock. There were a number of people like Rachel Carson with Silent Spring. There were a whole series of pivotal environmental and eco-related movements, which were about planet Earth being natural and beautiful, and humans being a despoiling invasion that killed life, polluted everything, the technology being evil. So there were a lot of themes like that, which led to the modern environmental movement. And one of the common themes of some of those is the idea that more, that we are malign, humans are malign, and we need fewer people because there are too many. There were lots of predictions at that time that we were going to run out of water, we were going to run out of oil, we were going to run out of food, none of which turned out to be true. We have much greater abundance of all of those things than was ever predicted at the time. And we're sustaining a much higher population. But they're very strong movements, and I think they underpin a lot of the Just Stop Oil and other movements today, whose fundamental message seems to be that we are an evil influence, and the natural world, including the animals, we should minimise our impact on that world. That's the sort of underlying belief. I think animal rights people tend, those who are activists tend to put animal life above human life, for example. So misanthropic is the term, where people just think somehow that the human race is bad. Right,
I've got you. And this fear that, and I used to have it as well, the overpopulation thing, because it seems to make sense. We are X big, we have X resources. If there are Y amount of people, and that Y keeps going, we're in trouble. But again, this guy, he talks about the is if you think living in a degrowth world is a good thing,
be fun.
You've got a shock coming to you.
So what's the solution? That's you promised the solution.
He talks about building equitable, what he would call equitable conservative cultures.
Right. Okay.
And equitable as in, it's not, woman goes back in the home.
So it's not misogynist.
Yeah, exactly that. You have to find a way of balancing the demands, if you like. Yeah. And I think, and it has to be, doesn't it? Like one partner almost becomes the stay-at-home parent, which would be me in my case, probably. But building it so that everybody has a choice.
But that requires a cost of living where one income is enough to sustain a family, which is not true. So how do you fix that?
Thing. You have to change the economics as well, and that's the point where I got to in the podcast, and I was like, I had to go do work. But he was like, "This is not going to be easy, at all. It's not an easy fix in the slightest."
So it would be multiple factors. It would be reconstructing a new version of the family, which had the benefits without the drawbacks.
Yeah.
Dramatically reducing the cost of housing.
Yeah, and cost of living in general.
Cost of living in general, although the cost of most things is still relatively low by historic standards. I know it's gone up in the last 10 years, but so things like, although food and energy certainly at the moment is expensive, historically, that's probably a blip in the long run. Because solar and wind should give us, and batteries should give us very, very cheap energy in the future. And food prices, I think by 2002, they were some tiny fraction of what they'd been in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Now they've gone back
Yeah.
up a bit, and it's a lot for
Yeah.
people who can't afford it. But I think it's mainly a problem because other costs have gone up,
Yeah.
like with the fuel crisis, but also housing is a much
Housing
bigger
being the big one.
percentage.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
huge percentage.
so the
Yeah.
solution to housing is always touted as building a lot more than we ever do. And I think we've spoken before about that, it being as much a problem with companies holding on to land and not using the land, limiting what they build because that's where the profits are. So if you get a development, they don't build the whole thing at once. They build 100
No,
houses,
they
they
do
sell
it.
them.
Sell it. Yeah.
They do it over 10 years,
Yeah.
and they put in the infrastructure last if they can, because they want the profits from the
Can I
first
just jump
house.
in on that? Because that's
Yes.
a really important point, and it's something that's
Yeah.
very close, near and dear to my heart. Because obviously, I know that world relatively well because of what I know, what I do for a living. But also, and I had an epiphany about this.
Oh, right.
and it puts something that Ben Shapiro said once. I watched
right.
one of his videos. He gave a speech at university, and I do enjoy watching the Daily Wire guys go to universities because it's just like, why would you try and challenge them? They're just going to run rings around you. I don't agree with everything they say.
So is this a kind of come and convince me I'm not?
Yeah,
they put a
these
belief up, and
youngsters
you've got to persuade
have
them
got
the
no
opposite.
clue whatsoever, or they're so badly informed, or they get angry and shout. And it's like, come on, you have to do better than that. But he was talking, and again, this in the context of how I'll bring it to the context of housing in a moment. But he was talking about human rights.
Yeah.
And it was boring as hell to listen to him. When I switched off, I was thinking, God, this is crap. But I think he phrased it as positive and negative rights. So I don't really get it. I didn't get it at that point, and I'm probably again butchering the language. But the whole idea was if a human right requires someone else to do something for you, that is not a right that you have because you are taking someone else's labor, time, effort, money, whatever it is. Okay?
So this is a libertarian argument. Yeah.
I guess so, yeah. It goes, the right you do have is that you can open your mouth and you can talk. And if someone puts their hand over your mouth to stop you, that is someone removing a right that you have.
So this works in the same way.
You talking doesn't rely upon someone else doing something for you. Okay?
No, they don't have to listen.
The minute though someone has to do something for you, you're claiming that your human right overrides theirs and they have to provide this service to you. Okay? So we talk about food being a human right. We talk about housing being a human right, about water being a human right. Now, I agree that those three are, to my mind, very, very, they are goals that we should aim to hit. Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, the housing thing, though, if you go back to that, and again, it only occurred to me, was so let's just say, I see this on, and I saw this on Twitter a few weeks back, some young lad posted a picture of a stunning 4-bed semi-detached house with character. And he goes, this should be the norm for everyone, and it should only be £60,000.
Yeah.
And
it was.
It was. But he had a load
I can remember what it was.
He had a load of builders coming on going, you're a moron. The materials alone on that house are probably about 150,000 quid. Then the labour is another 100,000 quid.
Yeah.
So minimum cost, say 250 grand. I'm just I'm putting numbers out for there. £250,000. You sell that house at 600,000, something like that. Okay, my margins are probably totally wrong, but and then the guy went, well, it's a government choice not to. And I thought, hang on a minute. So how would this work in practice? You would go to every builder and go, you have to build houses and sell them at this level. And if they go, that is impossible, Mr. Government, because the materials that we need to get, the labour we need to pay for, and the land that we need to buy all cost significantly more than that. Are you going to reimburse us for those costs? Okay. If they said yes, which they would never do because they couldn't afford it in the first place, but if they said yes, and let's just say the price of housing started to come down because government influenced it to that degree, and they went, right, we're building X amount of houses. There is no way with our manpower shortage and the materials costs that we can build at a speed to really make a difference anyway, okay? But let's just say we did, and the waiting list for this government housing was X amount of million long. If I was a private builder, and I said to that customer waiting list, I will build your houses 6 months quicker than that one, and all you have to do is pay me an extra £100,000, and I would go and offer more money to the labourers and the materials providers, all the rest of it, and I would jump the queue as a private enterprise and get my customer base and make money that way.
Yeah.
In theory, I'm stealing someone else's human right because the houses that I'm building are going to people that probably aren't the most in demand. They just have the most money to be able to afford the premium boost, if
Yeah,
you
you
like.
could say that. Yeah.
So what are you asking the government to do? To stop that? To come and put a gun to my head and to the gun at the head of my workers and go, no, you're not allowed to? Your take is that what you want to reinforce, that human right that you have for housing? It's an impossibility. You can't control enough variables of other people's decision making, yeah, to fulfill the need of that human right for housing that people have. It's just not possible. There's a conflict of rights
Well,
there.
yeah, I don't know if I agree.
Ooh.
Because we had this problem before. So there was, back in the 20th century, there was an enormous house building
Yep.
surge, and back at the beginning of the century, there were very large families with small rooms, lots of
Yeah.
slums. There was a huge program to tear them down, and one of the big differences was that we had the ability that in those days to create council housing,
Yep.
and kind of council housing wasn't necessarily built by council workers; it was subcontracted.
Yeah.
But they did control the specification, the size,
Yep.
the fact that they had big plots, large rooms, nice gardens.
Yep.
And back in those days, the councils had the right to do that and to reinvest the
Yep.
proceeds from that. There was a lot less centralised control than there is today.
Yeah.
And that was hundreds of thousands of houses a year.
Yep.
I don't think in itself it would solve the problem, because I think the other thing you've got is much higher levels of immigration than we had in the past, which is fueling the demand. But being able to build to a certain spec to keep the costs down would actually have an effect on the wider housing market, especially if council housing became widely available again as an option
Yeah.
for people.
Where do you
Then
get the labourers from?
Well, you don't need as much labour as you used to build houses,
We still have, and
and I have an answer
Yeah.
for that.
Go on.
Which is that there have been what you can do is a lot of cooperative small scale schemes where people self build with support and assistance and guidance from the local council. And there have been various interesting pilots of this where people have built houses for £100,000 all in, decent sized houses, rather than going to a conventional builder and building a housing estate and then buying a house for 500,000. And people contribute their labour as part of the deal. So obviously the people need to be fit and able to do that. And part of the stake is owned by the government, and part of the stake they own.
Interesting.
You have low cost mortgages, again backed by long term government gilts, so they're not subject to market fluctuations. And some councils have done this, and they've had like 10 or 20 or 30 families get together and build. They build far more interesting houses, far more cheaply.
But you still need the skills.
And they don't require an army of builders. They do require experts to come in and do certain jobs.
I'm pretty sceptical about this, Tom. I can't do anything manual.
Well, they have people to teach them. So part of the job is that, I mean, some of the people involved have learned a trade through that. They might learn bricklaying, because they'll have a bricklayer, and then they'll teach 10 families how to bricklay, and then they'll have an electrician who will teach.
That is a fascinating model.
And they don't, obviously they don't train and qualify doing this, so there still has to be people to oversee it and certify. But the number of people you need is far smaller. But the point I'm making is that you could try this on a much larger scale, because the thing that's always overlooked is people's power to help themselves as a cooperative. We always think either the government does it or the private sector does it. We never think, well, what about the actual people who want to live somewhere? What about if they do it with the help of both the private sector and the government working together? And so I think there are ways to do things like that on a much bigger scale, but it requires throwing out the conventional model that you have to have somebody. You have to have a huge company that owns the land. You then have to have a huge company that does the house building. You have to have a huge army of private builders, and then the people buying the house have to get a huge mortgage for a hugely expensive house. For example, a lot of these houses are constructed out of wood, and it's far cheaper, and it comes from sustainable sources, and they will do things like have a natural grass roof. I forget what you call it now, a seed roof, which is also long lasting and good for the environment. But you don't get that on your housing estate, because you get a very narrow view of what a house is and what it has to be.
Yeah.
And so
I'm with you.
In practice, there's very little choice on the market, because all the developments are roughly the same, whether they're aimed at the executive homeowner or the new first starter. So I think there's a load of stuff we could tap into to reduce the labour need, to reduce the cost, to do things more innovatively, and to bring back things that we used to be able to do. And maybe, yes, we would have to limit immigration too.
Yeah, at least temporarily. Yeah.
But I think you
Yeah.
could bring house prices down. But ideology stops us doing that because there's been this decision to. I mean, councils are not allowed to build their own
That was
houses.
insane. That
Yeah.
then Tom, the councils are all pretty much bankrupt anyway at the
Well,
minute.
they're allowed to borrow, and they could borrow money to build. Because the point is the council can then think for the long term. Okay, if we build
Yeah, I'm with
we
you.
build new council housing, which solves. It's fantastically expensive to have to house people in B&Bs and hotels.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah,
Because they are
yeah,
refugees, or they've come from Ukraine, or they've there's no homes for them because there's no housing available. And actually, if they could think for the long term, build for the long term, and say, well, build these houses, they'll last at least 50, 60 years without major works,
yeah,
and we can build them to meet the type of housing that we need
yeah,
to promote families and
yeah.
having more children.
So that almost becomes like they would have to always be like the starter home. Then obviously once you
Well, a
hopefully
council
you
not
move up.
necessarily. I mean, I think you can. Again, I say if you seek out these programs, and there's been lots of them where people have self-built with help, and I'm not talking rich people. I'm not talking grand designs. Then they build large houses. They build like 4 or 5 bedroom,
I'd
but
have
they
to
build
see
them
it.
cheaply.
How do you do that if you've got a
I'll dig
full-time
out
job?
some.
Yeah.
I'll dig out some.
How do you do it if
some
you've got a
articles.
full-time job though? That's just like
Well, some of them
insane.
haven't got jobs. That's the point, and they
Right,
learn
right,
skills through doing this because you're
right. That is a
aiming this at the
brilliant
people most
idea.
in need, who are those
I think that's a fantastic idea.
who are
If you could
poorest.
find a way of combining that with actually going the
But
next step,
but the point is
people
you
getting
have
qualified.
to think totally differently, including the
Yeah,
people
I
in the
love that. I think that's
council,
really good.
and you have to actually think. Okay, we're going to enable. You have to stop thinking. You have to stop infantilizing and
Yeah,
labeling people as victims because they're poor, and you have to start thinking about how you untap their potential and support them. And then you have to think. You have to not drown yourself in. But I might get sued if this project goes wrong,
yeah.
because no one gets sacked for doing it the conventional way.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But
That's very good.
that's why you'd want a national scheme and it to be promoted.
Yeah.
So I think there's loads we could be doing differently. I totally agree. It wouldn't be just that. You'd need a number of factors to come together to encourage people to have more children. But again, if these people who build in a cooperative, like 10 or 20 houses, all get to know each other because they all built. In the examples I've seen, they build
build a
each other's
community.
houses.
Yeah, and you look after each
So
other's kids.
so then
and,
so then they
yeah,
do each other's childcare
yeah.
for free.
That's a really interesting. That's a really
You don't need a
interesting
day
idea.
centre. You don't need a day centre that you have to staff and pay for, and someone has to make a profit
Yeah.
out of. You can organise it between the 20 or 30 or 10 or 20 families that you have who you've got to know as good friends, and you all live
Yeah.
in one location, and
That's
then you
really
might
good.
build a play area and a building for the
I think
purpose
there's
of the
one
kids to go to.
there's one problem though, Tom.
Yeah,
I'm going to upset all of our viewers. British culture sometimes is incredibly selfish, right?
yeah,
And having lived I've lived in totally different areas. I've lived in the most dense urban areas that were relatively poor
yeah.
to relatively affluent, everything in between. I've never lived the 1% like lifestyle at all, but I've seen the other side quite a lot.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there is a huge amount of selfishness, even within the social housing scene, behaviourally, culturally. There's always
Yeah.
bad eggs that ruin it for everybody. So unless you would have that kind of, unless you could change British culture, like it used to be to a degree, hang on, you did your bit for your community. You have
Well,
to
I
do the
think
right
that's
thing.
what I'm talking about, and I don't think it's
Yeah.
innate. I don't think it's genetic. So I think
No.
I think in these schemes that I've seen, they don't build all the houses at once. So a load of people will help build somebody else's house, and then in return they will get help building their house.
Yeah.
That's how it's set up, and I think that does build a big community spirit. And I think that it's all about incentives. So yes, there's a lot of that behaviour now, but that's because of scarcity and fighting to find the to get on the only house the council's got, to jump the list to take it.
That's
So-
really
so-
fascinating.
I don't know if this is the answer, but I think it's part of it. That's what I'm
Part of it, definitely. Yeah. Well, like we said,
Yeah.
there is no simple answer to this at all. Because if there was, let's face it, some of the Scandinavian countries have got much better home building markets than we do. They build quality social housing, like really beautiful things, and it's all very well thought of, and even they have this fertility problem as well. So you're right. It's not a simple thing. I don't know what the future holds, and it's one of those where we've got these like going back to our start of our conversation, we have these we jokingly said we have these existential threats, but we do. We have the existential threat to a degree of climate change, but then also in the climate modelling, though, does it take into account population collapse? I don't think it.
Well, let's not get into that one. That will be another.
Yeah, we'll be here forever.
Another podcast.
Isn't it a fascinating topic though? Because and again, it's scary.
Well, so yes, it is fascinating. But I was just thinking to tie it back to this. One of the questions in my mind is, if we do have this dramatic reduction in population, does that not massively incentivize having kids again as an economic necessity? So does it actually go in a cycle where before you collapse to nothing, you inevitably have to solve this problem?
But what is?
But right now the incentives. Right now we're not where the incentives are to fix it.
Right,
today.
I'm with you, but I think we're seeing enough places that are, though. The fact that Albania, was it Albania I said? Oh, sorry, Hungary recognised this to a degree. I think their reasons were slightly less positive. But the fact that South Korea can't solve it, Japan can't solve it, they just can't. And it's this it's culture. Going back to what you said, it's community is culture. Community is culture on a small level. How we get back to that, I think so many of our would be solved.
Yeah, I think you have to have lots of small initiatives that encourage people, have the incentives to people to work together and support each other. Instead of expecting the state to solve it or some company to solve it.
Or we just become tyrants and do everything, Tom, and rule the world.
I don't want to do anything.
Yeah, it's not my job. Oh, I'm wobbling the table. Yeah.
So that's what I think.
Awesome.
I think that's maybe the way.
That was a good chat, though. Enjoyed that. That was a good conversation.
Okie dokie.
Awesome.
Nice talking to you.
You indeed. Let's try not to leave it so long next time. That was mainly my fault.
That's okay.
All right, I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Take care, Jamie.
Take care.
Bye bye.